Hello, welcome to Guide London. My name's Nick Salmond. I'm a London Blue Badge tourist guide, one of many members of the Association of Professional Tourist Guides, and they are the people behind the Guide London website. Now, over the last year, we've been doing a number of broadcasts, giving you a little taste of what London's like to live in, to visit, some of the things you can see. We've talked about some of the people who live here, some of the history of the great city, some of the culture of the great city. If you've missed any of our broadcasts, then go to Guide London on either YouTube or Facebook, and you can find all our broadcasts there. Now, most of the time we've been broadcasting live. Today we're not live, but we have a special visit to a very special place in London. It's one of our great cathedrals. Now, London has more than one cathedral. We have, of course, St Paul's, the most famous cathedral in the country, but there is a cathedral that just sits on the south bank of the River Thames, and that's the place we're going to visit today, and that is Southwark Cathedral. Bankside on the south side of London Bridge is where you'll find Southwark Cathedral. It's an area crisscrossed with the railway viaducts and major roads around the busy commuter station of London Bridge, and towering over the station is the Shard. Underneath the railway viaducts you'll find the famous Borough Market, thronging with foodies eager to taste all the fresh produce that is on sale here. And it's a short walk from this area where you will find Shakespeare's Globe, the Tate Modern Art Gallery and the Millennium Bridge. And in the very centre is the almost hidden jewel that is Southwark Cathedral. Now, there's been a settlement here since Roman times, and you can see some Roman remains which were uncovered during excavations inside the cathedral. The Romans built the first London Bridge here, and with various buildings it remained the only fixed crossing of the River Thames in central London until 1729, when Westminster Bridge was built. In the early medieval period, London Bridge became the starting point for pilgrims to Canterbury, and inns catering from pilgrims and travellers developed over the centuries, to include, with the coming stagecoaches, the coaching inns of Borough High Street. The George Inn is one surviving example. Here we can see an etching taken from the early 17th century of central London. On the north side you see the City of London very congested, with St Paul's Cathedral in the centre of the picture. On the south is London's playground, attracting activities which were unwanted in the City of London over the other side of the river, such as the theatres, the bear baiting, the pleasure gardens, and prostitution. Bankside became busier and busier through the centuries, becoming home to multiple industries, including brewing, printing, glassmaking, a soap factory, and some warehouses. By the end of the 19th century, this area had some of the poorest housing and the worst environment in London, very different from the area today. Well, in the middle of all this, the church has stood through the ups and downs of the centuries. The first recording mention of a church on this spot is the Domesday Book of 1086, but we think that over 400 years earlier there was a convent and then a monastery on this site. The current foundation goes back to 1106, when two Norman knights, supported by the Bishop of Winchester, founded an Augustine priory called the Priory of St Mary Overy. Now, very little remains of that original building, but it was rebuilt in the 13th century, and a significant part of that church, with its stunning early Gothic architecture, remains today. The Priory of St Mary Overy continued until Henry VIII closed it, along with all the other monasteries in the 16th century. The church then changed its name to St Saviour's, and it became a parish church for the local area. It remained as such until 1905, when the new Diocese of Southwark was created, and it was decided that St Saviour's would become the cathedral for the diocese. At that time, quite a lot of work was done to make the church worthy of its cathedral status, including rebuilding the nave and installing many of the glorious stained glass windows that you can see today. We're going to go inside now and meet June Addison, a London Blue Badge tourist guide and a Southwark Cathedral guide. She's going to show us around some of the highlights of the cathedral and introduce us to two key members of the cathedral staff.
Thank you, Nick, for that wonderful introduction to this magnificent building. We're standing at the western end of the nave, and below these soaring neo-Gothic arches of the late 19th century reconstruction. I say neo-Gothic because the Gothic architects of the 13th and 14th centuries who designed this style of architecture built to glorify God. So when the cathedral came to be rebuilt in the late 19th century, when it was in such a bad state of repair, Sir Arthur Blomfield, the architect in charge, was very lucky to be able to incorporate in his rebuilding a very small remnant of the original 13th century church that you can see now. And you can also see just how exactly the Victorian neo-Gothic architects copied that great medieval style. Now we're in the western end of a church, which is traditionally the main entrance to a church. As you enter and your eyes lead you up to the holiest part of a church, the eastern end, where you can see the altar and the great screen behind it, and then above that the magnificent stained glass window, which we'll see a bit closer in a little while. The church's full title is the Collegiate Church of St Saviour and St Mary Overy. So we're going to move up the nave now towards the east end, and you'll get a better view of this magnificent nave area. Well, here we are in the central part of the nave. I mentioned earlier that the name of the church was the Collegiate Church of St Saviour and St Mary Overy. And that is referenced by this icon of St Saviour behind me. Now, the church was originally called St Mary Overy, and that was to distinguish it from a church in the city of London across the river called St Mary. So they called this church St Mary Overy, over the river. And that continued until the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. When the monks left the church and it was taken over by a secular administration, the name was considered rather too popish. And as the English church moved towards Anglicanism, they decided to adopt the name St Saviour. Now we know, of course, that St Saviour is not a real saint. There is no saint called St Saviour. But it allowed the congregation to be referenced to Jesus Christ the Saviour. When the church became a cathedral in 1905, they readopted St Mary Overy. So the church is now the Collegiate Church of St Saviour and St Mary. And St Mary is referenced by this very beautiful statue, gilded, over here on the north pillar, the Virgin and Child. Now, as we look again towards the east end of the cathedral, you will see a very splendid candelabra, gilded candelabra, hanging directly below the tower of the cathedral. Now, this was a gift, a very expensive gift, from an innkeeper called Dorothy Appleby in 1680. Now, we heard in the introduction how the road to London Bridge was a road that was used extensively by pilgrims, by visitors to London. It went to the only bridge across the Thames at the time. So there were many inns and hostelries along what we now call Borough High Street. And Dorothy Appleby was one of them. She must have made a very, very good living out of being an innkeeper, because this candelabra would have cost a lot of money. And she also left a significant legacy to build almshouses in the locality for the poor. But on a closer look at the candelabra, you will see that there is a crown, and below the crown there is a bishop's mitre. Now that is a direct reference in the 1680s, and it remains so today, as to the hierarchy of the Anglican Church. The head of the Anglican Church is the monarch, the sovereign, referenced by the crown, and below that is the mitre of the bishops and the archbishops, who are the religious heads of the English Church and who administer it. Now we're going to move right into the most sacred part of the church, the choir in front of the high altar. Here we are in the choir in front of the high altar, and in particular in front of this incredible screen behind the altar. Now this was a gift in 1520 from Bishop Fox, who was then the Bishop of Winchester. As I said earlier, this area was all part of the Diocese of Winchester until the 19th century. Now Bishop Foxy Fox, who survived Henry VIII's tantrums and his tyranny and died in his bed and has a very splendid memento mori in Winchester Cathedral itself, gave this screen to the cathedral, or church as it then was, the Church of St Mary Overy. Now, we don't know if it was ever populated with statues. There's nothing in the records to tell us that. And as the church moved beyond the dissolution of the monasteries and became part of the Anglican community and a much plainer style of decoration in churches, this screen was covered over with a wooden panel. And it wasn't until the early 19th century, when some restoration was commenced by George Gwilt in the 1830s, that they decided to reveal its glory once again. And then as the cathedral moved towards cathedral status in 1905, the decision was taken to populate the niches with statues, all of whom have a reference to the history of the church from its origins up to the current day. So let's just pick out two of importance. The first one, on your left, on the bottom row, next to the gilded Virgin and Child, is St. Peter, holding his keys in his hand. Then move your eyes up to the top row and move across to the right of Christ in glory. The second from Christ is a bishop. You can see his mitre. He's holding his crozier. And he's also holding a model of the church, because he is Bishop William Gifford. And he is the bishop who built the church when it was founded as the Augustinian Priory. Now let's move down to the gilded screen behind the altar. This actually dates from 1930 and was designed by Ninian Compa and is very similar and inspired by the Palo d'Oro in Florence. Now, two figures to mention on either side of the gate, the doorway. On the left is Bishop Lancelot Andrews, who was a bishop of Winchester, and therefore the church fell under his jurisdiction, and he died and was buried in this cathedral. So he has a magnificent tomb here. And on the other side is Bishop Fox himself, holding a copy of his magnificent screen that we've just talked about. Well, here we are in the choir, and I'm with Mr. Dean, who is the Dean of Southwark. May I call you Andrew?
You certainly can,
Thank you, Andrew. Andrew Nunn, Dean of Southwark. Could you tell us what the role of a dean is?
Yes, so I have two functions really. One is to chair the chapter, which is the governing body of the cathedral. And the responsibility of the chapter is looking after every aspect of the cathedral's life. And so I'm supposed to give some direction and vision for that to happen, and working then with my colleagues to make sure that we can deliver on that. Part of the job is keeping the roof on, keeping the walls up, and keeping the fabric good, particularly when we've got a historic building like this. And the other aspect is being the senior priest in the diocese. So we have 600 priests in the diocese, and I'm meant to be the senior one. What that actually means at the end of the day, I've never quite worked out.
Thank you very much. Now, you touched upon the next question I was going to ask you, and that is keeping the fabric and the cathedral in good order and repair. That must be an incredibly expensive exercise. How do you fund it?
It's a good question, and I mean, obviously that is something of a struggle for us because we don't charge for entry here at Southwark. So unlike our sister cathedrals, if you can call them both cathedrals, in that sense, Paul's and the Abbey, both have to charge for entry. We've never done that, and we've not done that for a number of reasons, and principally so that people can access this amazing space whenever they need to say their prayers and to light their candles and do all of that. But it then does make for a challenge to how you keep the place going. So we rely very heavily upon congregational giving, upon the giving that visitors just offer when they arrive, and hopefully they like the place and want to support it. And then we go out and we look for grants wherever they're available and hope that people will keep us with the finance that we need to do the work that's required.
Yes, I've noticed that you have electronic means now of donating.
You have to try every means, really, for getting donations. So yes, this contactless donation system, I mean, it's perfect, especially during a period when everybody's wanting you to use contactless. So we hope that people will be generous with that, and they are. Because I think people do love this building and recognise how special it is in a very special part of London.
Yes, well, a very special part of London that has seen many celebrations and many tragedies in your time here. How do you feel the cathedral role is in those times?
I think it's essentially it's being here. So the fact that however you tell the story or the history, however you describe that, there has probably been a Christian presence here for 1400 years, or that's the kind of figure that we sort of work on. That means that the community here has seen everything. 1400 years, we've seen raiders coming up the river, we've seen plague, we've seen fire, we've seen war, we've seen good times, we've seen a royal wedding here. We've also, in the last few years, seen the effect of global terrorism coming home to our community on 2 occasions. We've seen tragedies, and now we're seeing the effects of this pandemic. And in each of those situations, you want to be able to speak positively into it and give people a message of hope, and I hope that we've been good at doing that. But also I think it's what is essential is for people to know that this place is here for them, and that they can find God here. Now, in a way, of course, you don't need to find God because God has already found us, and God doesn't hide from us. But I think people need to come to a place that has a sense of holiness about it. And even if you're not a religious person in a kind of going to church kind of way, I think people do respond still to the spiritual increasingly in our society, in our secular age. And they come here and they find something of the presence of God. So the building helps us really to do the ministry that we need to do.
Which brings us really to the relevance of the building in the 21st century, isn't it?
Yes.
And is that what you hope people will take away from them when they have visited?
Yes, I think it sounds strange to those listening in on this conversation if I said this building's always evolving, because it seems to be extremely solid and is as it is. but actually the building does evolve in terms of the ministry that's offered within it. It has a stability and it has a presence given through the ages. But the cathedral and the cathedral community always needs to be adapting as the needs of the society around it adapt. I've been here now over 20 years, and I've seen a huge amount of change. You know, if you just consider when I came here, the borough market was a wholesale market, not a retail market. Now people come here thinking principally about food. And one of the things that we can say from the cathedral is, it's great you've come to think about food, this is a place where you can be fed. You see what I mean? So you're constantly interpreting the message for the age. And you're not doing that in a cynical way, but you're picking up on what people are thinking. And I think that we've shown ourselves in the response that people have made here to whether it was the HIV/AIDS scare of sort of former generations, or whether it be around inclusion or Black Lives Matter or whatever the issue is. We like to get behind these things. We like to show that this is our concern and God's concern, and we want the building to help to articulate that in the way that the building can.
Well, thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for spending this time with us, and warmest wishes to you and the cathedral for the future. Well, here we are in the heart of the choir. And I want you this time to look down instead of up. Because on the floor, there is a slab. And on it is written, Edmund Shakespeare, died December 1607. And yes, he is the brother of the great bard himself, William. And he is here because he was a member of the Actors' Company, the Chamberlain's Men, who performed at the Globe Theatre. And our records tell us here in the cathedral that he was buried in the morning. Now, this is unusual, apparently, for the early 17th century. Mainly burials happened in the afternoons. But of course, the play had to go on, didn't it? So he had to be buried in the morning because the mourners would, for the most part, have been his fellow actors, and they all had to get back and costumed up, ready for the proverbial curtains up. Now, in this area, we also have two other literary connections. We have the burial of John Fletcher, and then beyond him, Philip Massinger. But now we're going to go towards the very oldest part of the cathedral, called the retro choir. Well, here we are in the retro choir, which literally means behind the choir. And this is the oldest part of the building. It dates from after 1212, when there was a catastrophic fire which destroyed the priory. And this is in the style of early English Gothic, which is referenced by lower ceilings. They didn't yet have the technological skills to build as high as the nave then now is. So we have lower ceilings, simple vaulting, and tall, thin, penciled windows. Today it houses 4 chapels for private prayer, all dedicated to different saints. But what I would really like to talk to you more about is 2 of its stained glass windows. And the one I'd like to start with is this one here. This is called the Rider Window, and it is the work of Lawrence Lee from the 1950s. And it's the Thomas Rider window because it references Thomas Rider, who was the artisan builder of the new 19th century nave that we saw earlier. And it has many references in it to the artisans who would have been needed and continue to be needed by the cathedral to maintain its fabric. But let's start in the bottom left corner, where you have a black robed figure and some red stained glass. Now, this is the bishop at the time, Peter de Roche, who is looking at the red, which depicts the fire of 1212, which destroyed the cathedral. Destroyed the church behind. You can see the Romanesque Norman arches of the Augustinian priory. So he's looking sadly at the havoc caused by the fire. Then moving upwards to the Virgin Mary and the child Jesus in the middle at the top. Jesus is holding a carpenter's square, a set square to remind us of his childhood working in his father's workshop, but also the craftsmanship that would have been needed to build churches across the centuries. And then moving down to the bottom right, we have a reference to the history of the church, and the people who were involved are depicted across the centuries. So let's start on the left-hand side. We have a nun. Now, we believe that there was a convent here before the Augustinian canons were installed by Bishop William Gifford. Then we have a medieval bishop to remind us of the number of bishops that were from the Diocese of Winchester across the centuries. Then we have an Elizabethan merchant to again remind us of the history of the cathedral, when the cathedral, the church, was run and administered by a secular group of merchants and local businessmen. And then finally we have a Victorian clergyman, which brings us right up to date and its building from the 19th century. And at the bottom, etched into the glass, is a depiction of Thomas Ryder himself. The window was given by his family in remembrance of him. And then we're going to move to the right to the cathedral's latest stained glass acquisition. This very vibrant, colourful window by an Icelandic master craftsman called Lífa Pjónfjord, and it was installed to commemorate Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II's Diamond Jubilee. And that is referenced by the 60 spots, sparkling spots in the window to remind us of her 60 years for her Diamond Jubilee.
So we're joined now by Michelle Ford, who is the Volunteers Officer for Southwark Cathedral. So Michelle, tell us what a Volunteers Officer does.
So my role really is to recruit the volunteers for the cathedral. So all of our various volunteer groups have team leaders. So I offer the team leaders support if they need support in recruiting volunteers. As well as that, I'm responsible for my own team of volunteers who are the welcomers. So the recruitment includes sending out application forms, meeting with the potential volunteer, and then other checks such as references. So that's the main role.
So is there a typical type of volunteer that will come and help at Southwark Cathedral?
Yes, even though we're welcome to everyone, and we do have volunteers from different walks of life, different ages. I would say our volunteer base is predominantly older. A lot of our volunteers are Christians. You don't have to be a Christian to work or volunteer at the cathedral, but we do tend to have people who, have quite strong Christian faith.
And dealing with volunteers can be quite difficult sometimes. What do you enjoy about dealing with the volunteers you have at the cathedral?
Well, we have got, a diverse range of volunteers. They come from all different backgrounds, and they've got some really interesting stories actually, and they've, had interesting lives, and really some high-powered jobs. So I learn a lot from the volunteers just speaking to them and, you know, hearing about their life. They give you lots of tips and lots of advice as well. So yeah, it's really interesting.
And what do you think volunteers add to the visitors' experience when people come to visit the cathedral?
Well, our volunteers have a wealth of knowledge about various different subjects. As you probably know, we have volunteer guides. We also have people who do have paid guides jobs, ex-teachers, ex-masters. Our volunteers are very enthusiastic and very knowledgeable on a number of subjects.
And obviously, you're working from home, as a lot of people are working from home at the moment. But when you are in the cathedral, what's your favourite part about the cathedral, about working there?
Well, I love all aspects of the cathedral, but I particularly like the herb garden. It's a really nice place to go and relax. It's beautiful in the summer as well, so I enjoy, you know, walking around the herb garden from time to time when I can, when I'm not too busy.
And it is a beautiful spot, isn't it? Just alongside the River Thames, right in the heart of London.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. You know, we're welcoming to all. We're free of charge, so anyone's welcome at any time. Obviously, it's a bit different now because there have been times where we're closed. We were closed. We're open at the moment, and we welcome everyone to come in and have a look around.
So thank you so much, Michelle Ford, for telling us all about Southwark Cathedral.
That's
Hopefully, when the pandemic's over, we'll be able to welcome people on their visit to London back to the cathedral.
absolutely. We look forward to it.
So here we are in front of what we call the Shakespeare Window. Now, there are no stained glass windows on this southern aisle of the nave, except for this one. And that's because all the windows on this side were blown out by a bomb during the Second World War. And it wasn't until 1957 that the cathedral commissioned Christopher Webb to celebrate one of England's greatest poets and actor, whose Globe Theatre was just down the road. And Christopher Webb designed a window in 3 different sections. So on the left-hand side are the comedies, referenced by Puck at the top, the little green imp, next to Bottom with his ass's head from Midsummer Night's Dream. Then as we go down the window, there's Fat Falstaff in his red jacket. And below him, the grey and black robed figure of Portia from The Merchant of Venice in her lawyer's robes. Not exactly a comedy, but not a tragedy either. And on the other side, on the right-hand side, we have the tragedies. Right at the top, the ill-fated lovers Romeo and Juliet. And then as we go down through the window, the great robed and bearded figure of King Lear, and Hamlet in his black velvet doublet holding the skull. Alas, poor Yorick. And then in the middle, we have a depiction of Shakespeare's last greatest play, The Tempest, referenced by ethereal Ariel at the top, Prospero directing his cast, and at his feet, his creature Caliban. Along the bottom, Christopher Webb chose to reference the 7 ages of man from the first few lines of As You Like It. All the world's a stage, and all the people on it merely players. And they pass through 7 ages of man. So on the extreme right-hand side is the infant, mewling and puking in his nurse's arms. He goes through school days, adulthood, and finally ends as an old man, sans eyes, sans teeth, sans taste, sans everything. And then below the window, we have the sculpture of the great bard himself. So in this alabaster sculpture of Will himself, he always holds a sprig of rosemary in his right hand for remembrance. And the artist has chosen to depict behind him the skyline of the South Bank as it would have been in Shakespeare's time. So when we start from the right-hand side, we can see the former entrance to the old London Bridge. And then as we move along towards the left, we can see the tower of Southwark Cathedral. And then moving farther along, we have the roof of the Bishop of Winchester's palace, none of which remains today except a remnant of the Great Hall, which you can see on the walkway along the South Bank. And finally, probably most importantly, is, of course, the Globe Theatre, with its flag raised to tell us that a play is on. And that theatre has been reproduced exactly as it would have been in the 17th century. It burnt down in the 17th century and is only referenced today by a plaque in Park Street. But if we move back towards the right-hand side, you will see a black plaque. And that black plaque commemorates a man called Sam Wanamaker, whose great dream it was to recreate Shakespeare's Globe Theatre. And thanks to his efforts in the 20th century, he managed to get his plans off the ground. Very, very sadly, he died before it was completed. He died in 1993, and the theatre itself was opened by his daughter, Zoe Wanamaker. So we have much to thank him for. You can go and view a Shakespeare play exactly as it would have been performed in Shakespeare's time himself. And you may get wet if it rains, because it's open air. And now we will go to have a word about another great figure in English literature. And here we are in front of the window dedicated to Geoffrey Chaucer. He died in 1400, and this window was installed in 1900, the anniversary of his death, when they were rebuilding this magnificent nave. And it depicts a tabard at the top, the royal coat of arms, a tabard. Now, in Borough High Street, there was a tabard inn. And that reminds us of the pilgrims who started from this point in London on their pilgrimage to Canterbury. And Chaucer is known as one of the first poets to write in the English of the Middle Ages. He was a contemporary of John Gower, whose magnificent tomb is to his left. But let's just focus on Chaucer. He was a man of the court. He moved in quite high circles. He was a soldier, he was a diplomat, possibly a spy for his two monarchs, Edward III and Richard II. But he is principally known for his poems called the Canterbury Tales. And they were supposedly written by pilgrims on their way to Canterbury to entertain each other on their pilgrimage to the shrine of Thomas Becket. So, as I said, at the top of this window we have a tabard, And below that, we have horses leaving the courtyard of the inn. And if you look closely up at the top on the left-hand side, there is a very lovely little servant girl leaning on the windowsill, watching the soldiers, watching the horses leave. But below is a depiction of Thomas Becket. He's holding his Archbishop's cross in his left hand, and with his right, he is pointing upwards to the sword that was his martyrdom in 1170. Now, there was some debate when this window was commissioned as to whether it was correct to depict an inn, a place of alcohol, in a church. But the counter-argument, of course, was that Jesus Christ was born in an inn. Well, we've reached the end of our tour of this great cathedral. And we're going to finish here in front of the magnificent east window, the work of Sir Ninian Comper in 1950. It shows a beardless Christ in glory, his arms outstretched with 7 doves perched along those outstretched arms. He is reaching to the Virgin Mary on his right-hand side and St. John the Baptist on his left. He is standing on a globe, and his outstretched arms are welcoming you into this great space and this great cathedral. And I hope that you will also come and receive such a warm welcome from everybody at the cathedral when you choose to visit. We would love to see you. The opening times these days are somewhat difficult to predict, but do please look at the website, which will give you all the up-to-date information. It's been a pleasure to take you around the cathedral, and I do hope that we will be able to welcome you in person at a very early date in the future.
Thanks so much, June, for that fascinating look around what is a very interesting building on the south bank of the River Thames. And as June said, it is free to go in. Now, obviously with COVID at the moment, the access times keep changing. So the best way to find out when the cathedral is open is to go to the cathedral website. You will find it at cathedral.southwark.anglican.org, and there you can find lots of information about the cathedral, including information there about the Dean, who we spoke to earlier on, and you will find out when you can go to services, and you also find out when the cathedral is open for visiting. So the place to go is cathedral.southwark.anglican.org. If you want to find out any or more about any of our guides, then the place to go to is guidelondon.org.uk. There you can find out all about the different tours that our guides offer, all about some of the great buildings you'll find in London. We have a page on blog posts, blogs. Now, this is a very popular part of the website. You can find out all kinds of information about London, about its history, and about its people. For instance, you can see at the moment we have blogs on guiding teenagers around London. Not the easiest thing to do always, you might well think. We have a blog there on the Black Sailors of Georgian London. London's always been a very multicultural city. From postman to blue badge tourist guide, you can find out some of the routes that some of our guides took before they became blue badge tourist guide. So a lot to find on the website. The place to go is guidelondon.org.uk. So thank you for joining us today. Thanks to June Addison, who took us around Southwark Cathedral, and a massive thanks to Eve Milner, who acted as producer and a cameraman on today's programme. So she set up all the interviews, she set up all the arrangements to produce today's programme from Southwark Cathedral. So a massive thanks to Eve for all that. Thank you for joining us, and please do join us next time here on Guide London.